Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, back in today to talk about Oshi no Ko, chapter number 146. This chapter is titled Roll. And let me just say, from the get-go of this chapter, things start off the walls, and they end off the walls too. This is a very crazy chapter from front to back. If a lot of people complain about last chapter, which was all about Tsukiyomi or Crow Girl, her doing all the acting she was supposed to do in the movie, and the sort of story behind why Aqua and Ruby had been reincarnated into their new forms. This chapter is the exact opposite. This is what a lot of people wanted last time, but didn't end up getting. This is that high, very high octane things of just holy crap, a bunch of stuff's going on, and a bunch of story elements are being progressed until we eventually see that most of the movie has been filmed and wrapped up by the end of the chapter, right? It's not totally, but we'll get into it. Like I said, this chapter is titled Roll, and really, without further ado, I already said what happened last time. We had that whole chapter on Crow Girl, and you didn't really need to know that to get into this chapter just because it hops on such a distinctive point. But yeah, I'd say let's just hop on right into it. So we start off this chapter with a scene being filmed in the movie The 15-Year Lie, as we see that Ari is there with, of course, Hiakru, or Aqua. Of course, these are, like I said, Frill is playing Ari, and Aqua is playing, of course, Hiakru, but it's Ari and Hiakru coming together. And we see that Ari is very upset at Hiakru in this moment, as she just says, oh, I see, so you chose her. Obviously referring to how Hiakru has chosen Ai by this point, sort of really getting to know Ai better and all of that, and Ari is, of course, taking notes of this. But she eventually says, hey, but don't forget, Taiki is your child. As we see her just with both hands over her stomach, which obviously seems to give the impression that she is currently pregnant. And we see Hikaru's face in the next scene. We see that he has two full dark Sharingans in his eyes. And Ari just says the line of, you can never run away from me. And we see the tear in Hikaru's face as this line is being said. Also, another thing to note, the contrast here of how Ari's text bubbles are all black with a white outline around them, and the text is in white. While all of the other normal text bubbles are, of course, white on the inside, black outline, and black text. So it's very interesting to look at, as we eventually see that Ari just says, hey, someday you'll come back to me anyway. No one will ever love someone who's hopelessly empty like you. And we don't see Hikaru's reaction after this, but we sort of see it in the next scene. But we can just tell that Hikaru has been filled with despair, as we eventually just cut over to cut number 139, titled Misunderstanding, as we see that what is presumably Ai's apartment, if I'm not saying this is Ai's apartment, as she is sitting there on a beanbag chair, and she's got her legs spread, and in between that is Hikaru, who's sort of laying on her, sort of hugging her in a way. And while they're in this sort of weird position, Hikaru just says, hey, Ai, you're not going to abandon me, right? And he's like, you love me, don't you? And as he says these words, they both sort of get up, and Ai sort of sits straight up a little bit, and looks Hikaru in the face. Of course, both of her light Sharingans are contracting to, of course, both of Hikaru's dark Sharingans in this scene. And she just sort of gives that answer we've seen plenty of times throughout the series, where she's sort of just well, lies don't really work on you, so I'll just tell you up front. And she just says, I don't know. And we see that this also takes Hikaru very hard. Hikaru takes this extremely hard, as he sort of gives that 1,000-yard stare over at, who's his face? I don't know how I forgot her name for that long, but he sort of gives this stare at Ai, and Ai sort of just looks at him oh, yeah. But Hikaru just has that despair in him. And eventually, he's walking outside. It is currently raining, presumably from Ai's apartment. And as he's just walking along the road, we eventually see that Seijiro, I think is his name. This is a person who's played by Taiki in The 14-Year Lie, who is Ari's husband in this timeline. And we see that Seijiro is sort of walking by and he's like, hey, what's wrong? And he's like, hey, why are you standing in the rain? Like, Hiakru, come on, tell me something, right? And Seijiro's like, hey, if something is like really troubling you, like, just tell me, I'm all ears, dude. And Hiakru just like looks up at Seijiro, like, and we honestly see that he's crying a little bit as he eventually looks up at Seijiro and tells him the truth, as we get to the title of cut number 151, Her Betrayal is Coming to Light. As we see Seijiro's reaction to this is, of course, he's holding his umbrella, and he's holding his umbrella in such a way where it's sort of tilted and covered a good portion of his hair and face, where we can only see one eye in his mouth just staring at him. Of course, Hiakru here is like very much like, oh yeah, I just did that. We eventually see that cut number 147 is Seijiro's rage, where we eventually see that Seijiro goes home, yells at Ari, they have a big fight, and Seijiro puts both of his hands around Ari's neck. And then cut number 150, the Himikawa couple's double suicide. Of course, this is what we know has happened. This is what we got in that big, long info dump from Taiki, I think, 70 chapters ago. And we just sort of get all of that. As we also then look at cut number 146, the importance of life. Cut number 162, Ai's rejection. And then cut number 170, that's the only way I know. And at the end, we just see the final cut. Number 202, Even Just One Wish. As all of these are sort of overlaid on the same page, as the entire time we just see a scene of Taiki, who we don't even get to see his face, but we just see his mouth screaming in agony, both his hands on his head, and he is just constantly screaming in this page as we see all the motion blur lines on there to currently just show that at this point Hiakru is not in a good state of mind. At this point, we cut over to no longer in the movie, as we cut to a scene where Aqua is looking down at the script of the 15-year live course, the final draft, and we see that there's a little poster on the wall for Strawberry Productions' South Caravan, or Scout Caravan. Just a little interesting note there that's going on. I don't think that's going to have any banners into the story, but it's just a little bit of like, oh, hey, this is something else that's going on at this time. This is a little poster in the room. But we see Aqua in the room here, and he's looking down, very, as we'll see in the next page, a character calls it with a very gloomy face, as he's staring daggers into the ground almost, or at least into the script of the movie. And at this point, we see that Kana walks in the room, right? And she makes a little note of, oh, what a gloomy face you have on, Aqua. And she's just like, hey, what's wrong? Did the role pull you in too much? Because, of course, yeah, playing Hiakru here must be a terribly troubling role for Aqua, because of course that's a person who had a deal in murdering his father and all of that, right? It can't be healthy for him to just play this role like this, it just really can't be. As Aqua sort of just goes over and stares a little bit of a dagger at Kana, as eventually he's just like, yeah, yeah, I sort of just want to die like this, right? As Kana just sort of looks at him, looks over to the side, and sort of just closes her eyes, and she's like, hey, for your information, I won't even be sad if you die, alright? As she's just like, hey, I'll just slap your corpse, curse that like I always do, and forget about you in no time, right? As she's just like, hey, if you don't like it, promise me that you'll never say anything about dying again, even as a joke, right? Sort of what she's getting across here is like, hey, I'll do all of these rude things, you some things I know that you wouldn't like me to say about you, and hey, if you don't want that to happen, don't say you're going to kill yourself. Simple as that, right? And at this point, I didn't mention it earlier because it's sort of just implied, Aqua had the dark Starngons in his eyes, but whenever this happens, we see that Kana even goes and sort of puts a hand on Aqua's face and sort of just squishes it all together. We see in this moment that he does indeed have a light Starngon, which is just a little cute thing, right? As Kana's eventually just like, hey, promise me, alright? As we sort of see she draws that, alright, promise me, okay, does that sound good? As eventually Aqua sort of just grabs her wrist, moves her hand off his face. It's like, hey, fine, I'll promise. As we then see Kana's like, alright then, sounds good, I'm super happy about that. And she's like, hey, I'll give you a super good reward for being a good boy. I'll cast a spell that'll make you smile for sure, right? As we eventually see that Aqua's like, a spell, what are you talking about? And eventually Kana just says hey, there's a power that will make you go crazy to the point of death, right? As Aqua's just like, hey, are you sure that you're alright, Kana? Like, do you need to talk about something? Is everything going alright in your home life? I mean, I know we haven't focused on you recently, but, like, are you getting enough screen time in the manga? Is everything alright? Like, you can tell me if there's anything wrong, Kana. But eventually Kana's like, hey, don't tell anybody about it, okay? As she eventually reaches up to a top shelf in this, I guess, break room where Aqua's been sitting this entire time. And she's like, hey, if I'm not mistaken, it should be somewhere around here. And eventually, she's like, ta-da, here we go. And we see what she has in her hands. Is she's got like a little bit of like it almost seems like fun dip in a way. As we see it's just this thing where she has this powder in her hand. She opens up this bag of stuff. She pours it in there and she shakes it all up. And she says like, oh, this is perfection. As, he's like, alright, now eat this. It's so delicious, it'll make you go crazy. Aqua doesn't believe it, but he ends up taking a bite. And he's like, oh man, hey, this thing is so good, it'll make you go nuts. And Kana's like, oh, isn't that right? As we see that these are sushi na ko chips, and she's like, those are a classic life hack. And she's like, hey, the problem is that the powder doesn't stick to them, just many of the chips whenever I shake it, as, Aqua's like a classic. And she's like, hey, how about the piece of chips are jagged so they increase the surface area? The oil content absorbs the cheese in the sushi na ko powder firmly. Pretty much just saying like, hey, to make these chips super good, you gotta add this powder to them. And from there, it really sticks well to the chips just because of it has a bunch of ridges inside of it, right? And Kana just continues like saying like, oh, the pizza nako is a match in heaven, isn't it? And she's like, it's rich and has a strong punch of sweet and a sour taste. And as she's going through all of this, she's like, hey, whatever you do, don't tell Ruby about this because she will definitely eat up all of the chips that are at the office. He's like, hey, so just don't even introduce that to her. Like, I'm fine introducing this to you because I know you're going to be smart about it, but please, for the love of God, don't tell Ruby. But eventually, who's his face, Aqua sort of speaks up, and he gives a little bit of a laugh. He's like, look at that, right? And at this point, he's just like, hey, you're really troubling me, Arima. As Kana's just like, what the heck? Like, do you have something you need to complain about me about? I just showed you these delicious chips, and now you're complaining to me? Like, what's your problem, Aqua? And she's sort of getting all sort of defensive about this. Aqua's eventually just like, hey, I'm not even in this situation right now, and I don't really have the right for it. But Aqua says, but whenever I'm with you, I just end up having fun. As he eventually just, like, gets up, takes the pizza nako chips in his hand, sort of just walks out, and he's just like, hey, thanks, Arima. And he leaves the room, and at this point, slams the door, and Kana is freaking out because of this. We see that she is massively blushing, and we see she's just like, what was that? And she's like, hey, isn't being fun together like one of the most important parts of like a romantic relationship, right? And she's like, is he saying that we're like compatible and like indirectly like, oh my gosh, like, well, what is he getting on about, right? And she's like, oh man, what is wrong with him? Like, even though he's the ultimate pervert and lustful devil who kisses on sister, like, it's so like, it's not even funny, right? As eventually we see that she finally calms down. She grabs both her fists and put them up close to her heart. And she sort of just leans down, obviously showing that she's got a little bit of a heartache going on here. And quietly in the room, she just says like, hey, I always end up having fun when I'm with you too. She says love is a very troublesome thing. As we sort of see that Kana sort of looks off into space in this final moment. As for the end of the chapter, we cut off to a final scene. We see in the general area, I guess this is a shrine in Japan. There is a torii gate, which is of course of those like big gates that sort of have the two posts, like, and then like the weird curved post on the top. It's a torii gate. If you don't know what a torii gate is, either reread this chapter to the point I'm at, or go look it up on Google. Like, I'm honestly sure there are not many people who haven't read this chapter who are coming to watch this review. But hey, if that's you, leave a comment down below. I'd actually be pretty interested to hear about that. But we see that Ruby has had both her hands clasped. She's obviously making a prayer to this shrine. Or, she's making a prayer? She is praying to this shrine, that's what I meant to say. And we sort of just see that eventually it starts raining. And so she looks up, and of course she's not getting hit since she's under like the awning of the shrine. But she's looking out. Somebody finally comes up to her and says like, hey, is everything okay? I don't mind sharing an umbrella if you'd like. And Ruby looks back at this person, and she obviously does not realize who this is. And like I said, I have not filmed any of these chapter reviews recently. I said that in the last episode I did. But at this point, we already know what's going on here. And in the next chapter, she does not realize who this person is. But this person is none other than Hiakru Kamaki. Of course, the person who Aqua is playing in the movie. And of course, Aqua and Ruby's father. As we just see that this person, Hiakru, has come up and stood behind Ruby with this umbrella. And let me tell you, whenever I first read this chapter, the first thing I said to myself was, Ruby, you need to run. And like, that was my first reaction whenever I read this chapter. I'm like, holy crap. I've got a friend who I talk about Oshi no Ko with, and I text him, I'm like, holy crap, this recent chapter, like, you need to read it, like, because he doesn't read chapters on time, he never has. So I'm like, hey, read this chapter now, I don't care, get to the end, and like, you will not believe what happens. And yeah, Hiakru has finally been introduced to one of the two children. Now, Ruby should be able to recognize who this is because, of course, while it may not be Aqua, it is Hiakru, who Aqua has been playing in the movie, and they have enough of a resemblance to each other with being father and son and all, so I'd say it's pretty obvious. But going back through the chapters, a little thing I wanted to mention about earlier, just because, of course, we know how this series has often been portrayed as like, oh man, look at the two sister-kissing twins, Aqua and Ruby. And of course, they are playing Ruby and, or of course, Ruby and Aqua are playing Ai and Hiakru in this movie. So we sort of just get the scene wherever Ruby's just sitting there and Aqua's just like laying on her. I can definitely see like that Ruby was super happy about this scene, but I am glad that, who's his face, Akasaka did not show this in the chapter itself. Of course, Mingo Yorkie would have drawn it, but he didn't write anything in the script of the chapter about it, so that is nice to see. Like I said, the first half of this chapter is so heavy and loaded with all of this stuff of like, hey, just all of the scenes we get, like, hey, the misunderstanding, her betrayal coming to light, Seijiro's rage, the devil's suicide, the importance of life, Ai's rejection, that's the only way I know, and all of these other various things. And then eventually Aqua being swallowed up by the film just because of how sad and depressing it really is. Then eventually there's all of the Kana stuff, which I've never really enjoyed Kana too much. Like, I can enjoy that she is a good written character, but I've never really been into any of the stuff with her and Aqua. I've always just liked Akane more, as you probably know if you're watching this, and just her reactions and everything. And then the whole Sushi Nako chips joke is just okay. It's fine. I mean, I sort of get the joke that like Sushi Nako is like Oshi no Ko, except Sushi is Oshi, Na is No, and Ko is Ko. So I guess it's just like a little bit of a joke there, or at least that's what I took from the joke, because other than that, I didn't find it funny whatsoever. I mean, honestly, if I didn't have to do this review, I would probably have just went my entire life out never thinking about that joke again, just because I think it is pretty stupid. But the final moment where Kana like doesn't know what to think, she's like, oh man, what was that? It is a very cute moment, and eventually going to the end of the chapter where it's like, Ruby, get your butt into gear and run away. And for the love of everything, like, get away from that man. Like, you don't know well, you know the extent of things he's done because you've seen a movie being made about him. So, yeah, that's going on. But yeah, after that, I really don't have too much else to say about this chapter. This is a very good chapter. Like, I mean, I can even say that. I mean, there's so much craziness packed into it. Just great chapter all around. And yeah, with that, I don't have too much else to say about this chapter. Again, this was chapter number 146 roll. If you did enjoy this video, hopefully you won't mind checking out some of the Oshi no Ko chapter reviews on the channel. I'll have a playlist down in the comment section down below with all of the other videos that I've done. I've done plenty of them by now, so there's a plethora of videos to watch. If you want my opinion on chapter number 115, well, you can go look at it. So yeah, please go check out down below, and if you do enjoy that, hopefully you won't mind subscribing to the channel. Really helps me out. But even so, just watching another video and leaving a like down, it just helps so very much. And yeah, with that, thank you guys so very much for watching. And yeah, I really don't have too much else to say. Again, this has been chapter number 146, How to Roll, and I'll be with you guys next time for chapter number 147. This will be Glowplasma231, signing out.